many sights to see when I look in my window. So many different people to be that it's strange, so strange. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. Oh, must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch. Oh, must be the season of the witch.
Good evening, everyone, or afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. This is Dramatis Sermo, the Team Yume podcast, or side podcast, if you will, in which we are focused on analyzing, dissecting, and just reviewing media. Mostly animated features, although this time around we are tackling a live-action film. Joining me tonight is Matti Mali, also known as HedonisticActor.
Greetings.
There he is.
Is it hedonistic or hedonistic?
I believe the proper pronunciation would be hedonistic, but if you say hedonistic once or twice, I don't think anybody is going to be a grammar Nazi about it. It's not exactly a typical word.
Yeah.
Regardless, you are HedonisticActor, it's your name, so you can pronounce it however you want it. Tonight we are discussing about a film that was proposed for our consideration by Matti. Hence why I am doing this with him and not with Devar, which is my usual partner in these circumstances.
Tonight's movie is a Finnish adaptation of The Snow Queen from 1986, based on the classical H.C. Andersen tale.
Yes, the classic tale by Hans Christian Andersen. It was probably the most famous novel by Andersen not to be forever tainted by Disney, up until Frozen in 2013, that is.
Frozen is a masterpiece and I stand by that.
I mean, it's fine. It's fine. It's just fine. It merely does what Enchanted tried to do a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
It was fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's not bad, but it's okay. Speaking of it's not bad, but at least they tried, The Snow Queen from 1986, the Finnish adaptation, which, again, is the subject of this podcast. Now, I have seen a few adaptations of the classic fairy tale by Andersen. To this day, I stand by the opinion that the best adaptation was the Russian animated version.
Apparently the Russian animated version is from the end of 50s.
Yes, I believe that is the one.
Yeah, 1958 in Soviet Union. Also done in the same country as a live-action version in 1967.
That's good to know. That version was actually quite good.
Yeah, I haven't seen either of those, so I should probably get those.
That might be a future matter of discussion, but regarding the film that we are discussing tonight, I find it interesting. That is to say, I find its approach to the source material interesting. I am not going to sugarcoat it. This film is exactly what I expected it to be, even before I watched it. It did not disappoint in that regard.
Yeah, and your reaction to this is exactly how I expected you to react to it.
Well, I hate to be predictable about my consumption of media, but I also have to be honest, and The Snow Queen from 1986 is a bit of a snooze fest.
It is slow tempo.
It is a slow tempo, that's a fancy way of putting it, and we are nothing if not fancy. I mean, let me just fetch my monocle to look fancy, even though you cannot see me because this is a radio show, which is to say a podcast, but before we delve right into the film itself, I would like to hear a bit of background information about it. Who made this film, for example?
Well, the film is directed and produced by Päivi Hartzell, who has worked on short kid stuff. Her another work before this has been another fairy tale movie, King with No Heart, which I haven't seen. And this is her second and so far the last feature-length film.
I am not all that surprised to hear that.
There has been a very little information on what she did after this, but apparently some shorter documentaries or teaching and filmmaking and stuff. And that year it was Finland nomination for the Best Foreign Language Oscar race.
In lieu of my honest approach to review, I'm going to be honest with you. We are recording this podcast merely an hour after I finished watching that film for the very first time. And if I sound a bit on the lower end of the energy bar, that's because this film had completely drained me. It's also been a rather hectic day up until this point, and the social occasions always made me more tired than I already am, which is my default setting, being tired.
Yeah, it is one of those movies that try to enchant rather than entertain.
Yes, like I said, this is exactly what I thought it was going to be. I expected it to be a well-meaning film, to have a purity of intent, encumbered, however, by its ill-begotten stylistic choices, and also a lack of a proper budget. I expected it to have ambition, but lacking the means to properly convey said ambition, they had to resort to minimalistic means in order to breathe life into these diegesis. As such, there is a lot of dreamscape, esoteric, abstract imagery, and a lulling soundtrack to accompany said imagery throughout this entire film.
Yeah.
It tries to look enchanted and dreamlike, to convey the fantastical and also somewhat unwelcoming atmosphere of a fairy tale. Alternatively, it's akin to a dream, a nightmare that a child is having, which can also be compared to the dream of childhood itself, which is so short it ends before you realize it. I like that in concept. I like what the film does in concept in that regard. Its approach to the source material, its transliteration of the otherwise nonsensical story beats that all fairy tales tend to have, because fairy tales, as we all know, they value the cautionary elements, the moral, and the fantastical scenes more than a proper, well-constructed narrative. So if you have to transliterate that into a film, you either change something in order to make it make sense as a story, or you do what this film did, which is to say, embrace the mysterious, somewhat nonsensical, dreamlike logic.
You are onto something. You managed to guess the director's intent rather well.
The intent is pretty obvious, it's pretty transparent, it's all
Because
laid out in the text.
Yeah, I have a direct quote from her. It's a fairy tale tells about humans evolving from childhood to adulthood, and in this, like in many other fairy tales, the main characters are in the sleeping state of childhood in so-called latent phase. The queen represents seduction on the way to adulthood, necessary part of development. All fairy tales are naivistic. They don't speak to the mind, but to the heart. I've tried to, with these movies, methods and the colors and the imagery to emphasize this.
You know, there was another film that came out more or less at the same time, maybe a couple of years down the line, who approached this exact same kind of
Are you
theme.
thinking of Legend?
No, I was thinking of Labyrinth. But
Oh,
Legend
yeah.
is a good example too. Labyrinth is a bit more explicit than either Legend or even The Snow Queen about its themes of childhood and growing up and the dangers of growing up. In The Snow Queen, those dangers are embodied by the Snow Queen. In Labyrinth, they are embodied by sexy David Bowie Goblin King Jareth.
Though in this movie that Snow Queen's hair was something else.
Yes, I would like to talk about the costume design for this film, particularly the Snow Queen herself. As soon as I saw her on screen for the very first time, I burst out in laughter. So how do I describe her? Imagine Tina Turner by way of Beyond Thunderdome, except all white. That hair, that costume, it's wild, let me tell you. This film has good cinematography up until it doesn't. It has good music up until it doesn't. And it has efficient editing up until it's the worst thing I've ever seen. You could say it's a film of two halves. One half has the purity of the intention, the ideas, the refreshing minimalistic approach, which also is necessary to get around the budget issues that this film obviously has, also obviously. But on the other hand, there is the application of all those ideas and all those editing and cinematography techniques to a result that I can only describe as irritating. Extremely clunky and goofy. And I will expand on that. So it is a very artistically minded film, a very, I guess you could say, it doesn't even have a proper classic three arcs narrative structure, like any fairy tales, like the original story it's based from. We just have the main character going through a scene-by-scene adventure up until she reaches the Snow Queen herself, and then things happen. Every character she meets already knows who she is and what she is after. Things seemingly happen for the sake of happening, but again, that would be the nature of the beast. There is some sparse and scarce, very base-level commentary every once in a while. For example, that scene in the nobility's castle where the servitude literally is pretending to be ornaments.
I, by the way, searched quickly on how much this movie's budget will be on today's money, and it's about 1.9 million euros. So for a Finnish production, that was much, especially on that time.
Well, there is a reason why many European films, in order to compete with Hollywood production, would require several countries to team up together. A single country simply cannot dish out the kind of cash that Hollywood has in order to make films.
Well, you expressed your opinion about the Snow Queen's attire, but what did you think of her acting?
Well, her acting is very JoJo. And by that I mean she sure likes to strike poses, as in the same kind of open wide arms poses, as if she's about to indicate something in the distance, or she's just stretching all the time. it didn't strike me particularly inspired. A performance that I found a lot more inspired in that regard was the weird witch in the
Yeah.
second segment of the film. I think for convenience sake we would have to divide this film in segments
Oh
rather
yeah,
than
should we
acts.
tell to our audience what this movie is about?
Well, like I said, it's based from the classic tale by Hans Christian Andersen, which is a very famous tale about child abduction.
Yeah.
That's literally what it's about. The Snow Queen kidnaps a boy, and the boy's girlfriend goes after them, trying to save him from the clutches of the Snow Queen, which she's planning to dress him up as a little He-Man to retrieve some sort of grey skull MacGuffin that would grant her infinite power. Because
Yeah,
only a human can do that.
Yeah, that fetish gear was so weird. Though I'm not 100% sure if the girl is his girlfriend. Maybe they're just good friends.
They explicitly say it in the film that it is love.
Ah, okay.
That brings up actually an excellent point of discussion. This film has an interesting relationship with its own dialogues and conversations, which is to say, there are long stretches of running time that are completely deprived of dialogues. In those stretches, the cinematography itself and the perennial always playing soundtrack will do all the talking that is needed to bring forth whatever sort of dreamlike journey the main character is on. And then you would have segments, the proper segments, in which there are lots and lots of dialogues that don't really go anywhere.
Yeah, this movie has a problem to stay focused.
Yes, speaking of staying focused, the style, the aesthetic presentation of the film is mostly consistent. We mentioned the Snow Queen Tina Turner. There is also an interesting use of color palettes. Usually when the queen is around, we have muted cold colors. When the girl is on her own, we have, by contrast, more vibrant colors. Everything in between is usually accommodating to whatever mood it is that the film wants and aims to convey. So I have a problem with the editing in this film because, like I said, it is fine for the most part, but then you have those moments. Those moments in which the editing goes completely out of control and it feels so hard in producing a philological sequence that I lose my place in the film. For example, there is this moment in which the girl runs away from the witch we mentioned briefly, the one that actually goes out in the overacting department.
She looks like Joker's mom.
Yes, she has green hair and everything, and she is the most transparently evil character imaginable, and I liked her for that. But anyway, there is this scene in which she is running away from this crazy witch lady who enjoys kidnapping little girls and turning them into ballerinas for her music boxes or whatever. So she runs out of the gate of the house, and as soon as she runs out, the witch who was after her seemingly melts into a colorful dust. And then, where she stood, a bunch of little ballerina girls come out, and they immediately tell the protagonist to come with them. But logically, the main character cannot hear them because she's already outside of the gate. Except she isn't, she's occupying the same general area and space of those, because we cut immediately to her answering their call and saying, no, I have to go find Kai, or her lover boy, essentially. That looked weird. The editing was a bit confused and confusing in that department. I briefly lost track of the placing of the human materials in the scene.
I didn't notice that.
Because apparently, when the witch turned into dust, that was supposed to work as a transition to outside of the gate, where the ballerinas appeared, but it looked like they were appearing on the spot where the witch was. In fact, it looked like the witch literally transformed into a bunch of little girls. Which was a bit weird and bizarre. But that's not even the most egregious example of the editing fumbling things up. That's actually one of the most subtle examples. Then we have the third act. My gosh, it's a complete disaster. You see, the scatterbrained, almost dreamlike nature of the editing, for the most part, fits the mood that the film is going for. This slow-paced, weird and bizarre world as seen from the imaginative eyes of a child. It's supposed to look alienating and unrealistic. It works in that department. Even the scenes where the Snow Queen is on screen, as personally poorly handled as they are, they do reflect the bewildering, nightmarish scope that is this film's aesthetic. But then, in the third act, you have scenes that are meant to have some form of pathos, even some form of action to them. They are supposed to convey drama, and characters are supposed to be doing things, movements, motions, action set pieces. And that is the worst editing? One of the worst examples of inappropriate editing I've ever seen. Because you see, there is this moment in which the child, which is wearing this weird fetish He-Man cosplay, by the way, as we mentioned, is supposed to be fighting some sort of snow golem creature reasons. In between the music sounding oddly familiar, the child swinging his toy sword around as if he was trying to catch a fly, and the terrible camera work and editing making this already goofy scene look even worse. This was the Finnish equivalent of the Captain Kirk versus man in a rubber suit fight from Star Trek that everybody makes fun of.
So Kirk wasn't equipped with a sword.
But the music in this terrible moment almost sounded exactly like that theme that played during the, speaking of Star Trek, the Captain Kirk versus Spock fight that everybody makes fun of. Bum 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 bum. It sounded eerily similar in that regard.
Yeah, I guess that if you can't afford to flashy special effects, you have to do this kind of smoke and mirror tricks and hope.
Yes, but here's the problem. Usually, when the two human elements in the action scene cannot actually do action scene, you try to mask the obvious detail that they cannot do an action scene by switching to a more fast-paced editing. The editing for this scene was almost exactly the same kind of editing the entire film has had up until this point. You would have the camera just casually panning or closing up to a character for longer stretches of time, enough to expose how utterly goofy and fake this entire artifice is. It looked really, really bad.
Yeah, and it bothered me in that scene that Snow Queen, who is supposed to be master sorceress, didn't do much anything during that fight.
She just looked on, I guess.
It's a guy with a polar bear's head.
Yes, fighting little He-Man with a toy sword.
The most 80s sentence ever.
Yes, it is a very 80s film. Speaking of 80s films, the style of this film is mostly consistent, except when it isn't. Again, this seems like a leitmotif, because there is that one segment with the 80s punk gang
Oh, yeah, that.
kidnapping the girl, and then they have a song. And this film, mind you, is not a musical. That is the only segment that has a song in
Yeah.
it. That is so strange, isn't it?
Only explanation I can think of is that one of those crooks, Ismo Alango, is a well-known Finnish rock artist, so maybe that's the reason there's a suddenly musical number.
Yes, but usually musical numbers are in musical films.
Yeah.
This segment with the bandits that look like a weird mishmash between the Merry Thieves and 80s punk, which it's not a good look for this particular film specifically. This is the only segment that had a song, and it happened in the second half of the film. And it's not a bad song, I guess, but it doesn't really fit within the rest of this experience. But then again, you could almost justify it by saying what we have been saying up until this point, which is the intent behind this film to look like some sort of dream. And in a dream, nothing really makes sense from a narrative standpoint, or a thematic standpoint, or a philological standpoint, or an anything standpoint. Not necessarily. So you can have suddenly people singing, I guess. I am still trying to wrap my hand around as to what exactly happened in that final confrontation with the Queen, because it's not exactly clear. In between the weird esoteric lighting that every scene with the Snow Queen has, which is to say, cold and shrouded in darkness, and the surreal camera work that makes it impossible to very much understand where the characters are in a given scene in relation to each other. In between all that, that third act was a bloody mess to behold.
Yeah.
Because what I think happened, and mind you, this is only a theory, what I think happened is that while the Snow Queen was taking about 10,000 years to put the crown of magical MacGuffin power on her head, that would have...
Apparently it was. You have to put the crown on the precise specific moment or something.
Okay, yes, fair enough. But anyway, as she was doing that, taking her sweet time, the boy in the meantime had regained his senses and was holding in his hand one of his 3 buttons. And I have a tangent of its own about the magical buttons that are in this film. Apparently, these magical buttons, which come off the boy's outfit, the outfit he originally had when the Queen abducted him, they cause harm to the Queen herself. They burn. So they are established as important. But here's what I find confusing, or at least for the purposes of a narrative, if you will, which I don't know how useful of a preface that could be given the film in question, but regardless, those buttons come from the outfit that the boy was wearing, which is the same outfit that the Queen gave to him as she kidnapped him. What? So you can see my confusion. But regardless, let's put logic aside and let's focus on this moment, because the boy has that magical button in his hand, which is glowing. And then it glows some more, and then the Queen suddenly stops because she looks impressed at the glowing, and then we cut to next morning, and the kids are together again on the beach. And then the film ends?
Yeah.
Okay, listen.
Maybe they're supposed to symbolize his inner
Oh, I
goodness or
am
something.
pretty sure it's supposed to symbolize something, alright. But you see, like I said at the beginning, purity of intent meets a wall, and that wall is the execution of said
Yeah,
intent through the text.
Maybe they had sort of made the Snow Queen's destruction somewhat clearer. Maybe
I
some
don't
kind of
know if she even dies, because I think, if my memory serves me right, in the original story, the Snow Queen's heart gets unfrozen and she becomes good. I think. I could be wrong. And I think that is what happens in that scene, but it is not made clear in the slightest. In fact, it feels like an entire epilogue is missing in that sense.
Well, it is there, but it's told with images and music, as you mentioned before.
Listen, when this film chooses to convey itself to the audience through its use of a lulling soundtrack and good cinematography for a change, I think that is where the film is at its strongest. Unfortunately, that does not include every single scene with the Snow Queen inside. And also, whenever the editing is tasked to convey a certain amount of drama urgency at any given point, it cannot exactly do that to save its life. But I do like that final shot before the end credits, with the children dressed in white, clownish outfits, slowly running towards the camera in slow motion, signifying the moment where the dream of childhood ends. That was good. It has its good moments, its artistically fulfilling moments, but unfortunately the sum of its parts, and also a lot of its individual parts, for that matter, leave a lot to be desired.
Well, I do like its style, but
Yes, well,
yeah,
for the most part, I do
it
as
has
well.
hard time to stay focused. And for a movie that's called Snow Queen, it has surprisingly little of Snow Queen.
That's good, because the Snow Queen was one of the worst parts of this film.
Oh,
Which is sad. Again, Beyond Thunderdome, Tina Turner does not exactly strike me as a cool, calculating, seductive, and threatening Snow Queen. Not in my book. Honestly, Elsa is a lot more threatening than her.
I do like to visit that alternate universe where in Frozen Elsa is the villain.
Well, I'm pretty sure if Disney made that adaptation in 1990 as opposed to 2013, Elsa would probably look a lot like Maleficent, either that or Ursula. Can you imagine? Can you imagine Elsa as Ursula?
Uh,
Oh, you poor unfortunate souls! But alas,
yeah,
this is the film.
yeah, I have several notes that I made 3 weeks ago when I watched it.
Oh, please do share.
Let's see. I have seen this is, I guess, my second time when I've seen this movie. Good looking beginning, music. Quite easily you can become the ruler of the world. Everything becomes ice. What is the end game in this plan? Then there's-
So you're just going scene by scene, nitpicking it needlessly.
I write several notes when I'm looking at it, just like I would if I review. I would
Yes.
review it officially. Then there's the dancing on the desert. Where are these kids as parents?
Okay, yes, like I said, most of it is justifiable by the very specific stylistic choice that this film made. But since we are done with the serious portion of this podcast, let's just make fun of it. For example, that beach at the beginning of the film. If it wasn't for the occasional shots of the ocean, I would have thought that was a desert. An endless collection of sand and dunes.
Apparently, according to the thinking of this film. They filmed it in Canary Islands, Austria, Iceland.
I was perplexed by the sheer size of the beach.
Just so you know, Finland doesn't actually have that kind of mountains or that kind of castles.
I thought that was the case. Honestly, when I think of Finland, I think of a frozen tundra and wasteland.
Yeah, the highest point in Finland is like 1.3 kilometers.
That's pretty tall.
Mountaineer areas are more on the north, but yeah, mostly it's tundra. Then I criticize the acting of the children.
Yes, it's not the best, but then again, they are child actors and they have been given a reasonably hard and arduous material. I can forgive them. Honestly, their acting is not as bad as how the editing gets.
Very little dialogue. Then comes the creepy aunt who is offering hedonistic lurings.
HedonisticActor. Speaking of which, that scene in the castle where the servitude are ornaments and vice versa, and we have those two children sleeping together and doing what I can only describe a erotic play from the point of view of a child.
Yeah. I don't think the characters were fully aware of the implications of what they were doing.
I mean, they must be 12. I think they could have been.
All the adults in the story are weirdos.
Yes, well, that's also part of the package when it comes to old fairy tales. Most adults are scheming, sleazy, horrible monsters that exploit and betray children at the drop of a hat. Seriously, the ratio between good adults and bad adults in those kind of stories is very uneven.
Yeah, the only good adult was that one northern sorcerer at the end or something.
Yes, that's sorceress.
Who explains the story in case the audience wasn't able to follow.
Oh, yes, because, yes, the story, the quote-unquote story, all we get about the story in terms of a mention is that blurb at the beginning and the sorceress reiterating what the blurb at the beginning was all about, in case you forgot. With this film being 90 minutes long, but feeling like it's 3 hours long, it is a perfectly reasonable consequence to forget that it's supposed to have some sort of a plot. I wish it didn't have a plot. In fact, I wish it didn't have any point whatsoever. That way, its vision, its aesthetic, and its choice to tell the story in this particular fashion would have been much more consistent. This is a film that, by the very concept of its own specific stylistic choices, should not have a plot. If it tries to have a plot, it fails. It tried to have a plot, and it failed.
Yeah, in this movie she needed someone pure-hearted to
Yes, because this film made the absurd and confounding mistake of establishing a lore at the very beginning of it. You only need to establish a lore or a backstory when you're making a science fantasy or science fiction film, when you're making Star Wars, when you're making something that actually has a real plot to it, not the Snow Queen. Or at least not this version of the Snow Queen, which is the version that was not supposed to have a plot because it's all supposed to be a dream! By the very intention of the author.
If it's actually a dream, then nothing these kids do mean anything. If it's all just imaginary.
Like I said, the fact that it's not explicitly stated in the text leaves room for interpretation. That was pretty much the intent, to look and appear like a dream state, like the dream of childhood, to homage the fantastical nature of the source material of the fairy tale, of all fairy tales in that regard, to leave in only the bare essentials of cautionary tales and what have you. Anything else is unneeded, and in some case even detrimental. Giving a lore to this film is a bloody mistake.
Interesting thing is that according to this background stuff, there were added more scenes with the boy, because apparently in the original story it's sorely focused on the girl. At least build a tad more of the boy's character, so that when he does
What
save
character?
well, it's not much, but
Is Mini He-Man.
so that when he does
Oh, I just realized he was Mini He-Man fighting Beast-Man in that scene. Somebody needs to take that entire horrible fight scene and put on sound effects and music from the He-Man show. How does he save the day again in this film? It is not clear, because of a previous point that we already made. And I cannot continue this.
I wrote here that Snow Queen thinks the forces of light are stupid. I mean, that's her only motivation, I guess. The forces of light are stupid.
You see? The moment you introduce a story to a film like this, it is the same moment in which you introduce several unanswered questions that would not need answers if you didn't bother to propose the questions in the first place.
So are you suggesting that this movie would be better if it didn't have any context?
This film would have been better if it were 30 minutes long instead of 1 hour and a half, had no dialogues, and just let the cinematography and the soundtrack and the sound department in general convey the story of the Snow Queen, because it is in my belief that the Hans Christian Andersen's tale is timeless and universal enough. The basic gist of it can be understood at a fundamental level. It is a tale of love, abduction, and growing up. Is there anything more universal than abduction? And also the other two. So yes, this would have been better as a short film, for all the reasons we spent an hour discussing.
Overall, like is a strong word.
Well, okay, like is indeed a strong word. It's interesting, I guess.
Yeah, but it's more of a style over substance kind of thing.
It is extremely style over substance, and the style is also at odds with itself half the time. So that was our review of The Snow Queen, the Finnish adaptation from 1986, right?
Yeah.
Hey, that's the year I was born.
Oh, wow.
Yes, what an interesting coincidence. I share my birthday with this film. Okay, and on that note, thank you for joining us, everybody. I have been your host, Madhog, the Snowmaster, I guess.
And I've been HedonisticActor.
Yes. And he shall now retreat to his castle with living ornaments and underage kids doing some...
Don't take that out of context.
erotic play. Don't take that out of context, I beg of you. Absolutely.
Maybe they just don't know what erotic means, and they're just playing in the bed with the pillows and stuff.
Yes, like I said, it is an erotic play from the perspective of a child, which, again, does not make it any less awkward to witness.
Yeah.
But that was one whole segment. Every segment in this film is entrenched in weirdness, but none of them are particularly memorable, except maybe the witch in the first or second segment. But yes, this has been our review, and watch it or not. That is pretty much all I have to say on that matter.
Maybe as some kind of a social experiment, you can show it to your kid and see how they react.
I'm pretty sure they will be bored to tears.
Hmm.
Well, general audiences tend not to watch films that are overtly trying to go for an art house film like this one. And I use the art house term in a very short-handed manner, mind you. I don't have a clever, witty way to end this, so I will just end it.
Good night.
He-Man!